Just 2 weeks after the tragic loss of her husband in a sudden accident, Janet surprised everyone by remarrying. Her children, still grappling with grief, found their mother's swift remarriage bewildering. They had no idea their mother was even talking to another man. She had never even mentioned him. Taking it upon themselves, they looked into their new stepfather, and what they found out shocked them to their core. Overwhelmed by what they discovered, the kids dialed 911, their hands trembling as they awaited the operator's response. The dispatcher was surprised to be talking to a child and questioned if they weren't just prank calling him. "Is your mother nearby?" he asked confusedly, not trying to sound suspicious. Ellie, Janet's eldest daughter, sighed deeply. "Mom's downstairs, but she's in danger," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She looked at her younger brother James, who was keeping watch, but it was still safe. So she continued, "Please come quick. We found something that belonged to our stepfather, and it can't mean anything good." She looked at her brother again, but this time he was waving his arms in the air. Someone was coming. The dispatcher asked her something, but she was too panicked to listen and quickly hung up the phone and ran to her room. "What were you three doing there?" An angry male voice echoed through the halls. Ellie hid under her bed, scared of her stepfather. He had never hurt her, but after learning the truth about him, she hoped to never speak to him again. But why did Janet remarry that quickly? What did her children find out about her new husband? And did she know? Janet's husband, Martin, died suddenly in a freak accident. The whole family was devastated, as you can imagine, and they prepared for a long period of healing. But not even 2 weeks after the funeral, Janet announced that she would be remarrying the love of her life, Kelvin. She didn't only shock her parents and Martin's family, but her children too, who couldn't even begin to think about a new father. After her mother announced the news, Ellie ran out of the room crying, followed by her 2 younger brothers. Janet's mother, who was in the room as well, couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mouth fell open as she looked around, hoping her daughter was pulling a sick prank on her. But she wasn't. "This is Kelvin," Janet proudly said, as she pulled her new fiancé into the room. "I can't believe this," Janet's mother had said as she left the room to check on her grandchildren. When Ellie and her younger siblings came down again, Kelvin was gone, and Janet pretended like nothing bad had happened. "You'll get used to him after the wedding," she told Ellie, not caring about the tears rolling down her daughter's cheeks. Because no one supported Janet's decision to remarry so quickly, she and Kelvin eloped. One morning, Ellie came down the stairs and the whole living room had changed. Where a beautiful powder blue couch was before, stood now a tacky black leather couch that made fart noises when she tried to sit on it. Ellie was repulsed and ran into the kitchen to ask her mother about it. But when she burst through the kitchen doors, she walked into her mother making out with Kelvin. Ellie quickly backtracked to her room, slamming the door shut, overcome by emotions. She had never seen her mother intimate with someone other than her father, and it was a lot to process for such a little girl. She sobbed on her bed when her youngest brother came to console her. Her youngest brother, Erwin, didn't say anything. He simply hugged his sister, and they lay down on the bed next to each other. They cried together, both finding it hard to grieve their father with a new man already trying to take his place. But sadness quickly made space for anger, as Ellie found it even more heartbreaking to see her youngest brother in tears. She was only a child herself, but having lived through these traumatic experiences made her grow up very quickly. The urge to protect her siblings washed over her, and she wanted to get Kelvin out of their house as soon as possible. "Erwin?" she softly said to her youngest brother, who was still crying. He looked up, his eyes red and watery, waiting for what his sister was about to say. "Do you want to help me make Kelvin go away?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. Erwin wiped the tears from his cheeks with the back of his hand and slowly began to sit up. But how? He asked. Ellie thought about it for a minute. She never had a good feeling about that man, and something told her he could be hiding something. Let's find out more about him first. Right now? Erwin innocently asked. Ellie nodded her head. Her mother and Kelvin were both downstairs, so this was the perfect time to look through their room. They quietly left Ellie's room and snuck through the hallway, holding their breaths to be as quiet as possible. Through the banister, they could see their mother sitting on the couch with Kelvin, watching the morning news. The two of them crawled further down the hallway, passing by their brother James's room. He had his door open and saw them. They froze, exchanging quick glances, then waved James over. He looked confused, but didn't say anything as he got off his bed and came closer. Ellie, still in stealth mode, put a finger to her lips, motioning for James to keep quiet. "What are you doing?" James asked curiously, his voice just above a whisper. Ellie shushed him and pulled him down to their level. She leaned closer, whispering the plan into his ear, explaining what they were about to do. James nodded, eyes wide, as he listened to his sister. He turned to Erwin, who seemed nervous, and gave him a thumbs up. "Let's go," James said quietly. James, the middle child, immediately wanted in on their plan. The three of them crawled into their mother's room and stood up as they shut the door behind them. They glanced around, not sure where to begin. James moved to the closet, while Erwin looked under the bed. Ellie hovered by the dresser, ready to open the drawers and dig for any suspicious items. The kids were stunned to see the room full of moving boxes with Kelvin's name written on them, and his clothes scattered around like a teenager. It was obvious he'd already moved in, and there was almost no sign of their father left. "Let's look in those," Ellie whispered, pointing to the boxes. They each picked one and began to search through, hoping to uncover Kelvin's secrets. All three of them picked out a box and began to look through Kelvin's stuff. Ellie carefully removed the tape from her box, not wanting to make noise that would give them away. Meanwhile, James sorted through his box, finding a stack of papers that he squinted at, trying to decipher. Erwin sifted through his box, which was full of random gadgets and tools. Ellie opened a second box and immediately wished she hadn't. It was filled with men's boxers, some of them looking old and worn. She wrinkled her nose in disgust and quickly closed the box again, shoving it to the side. "Gross!" she whispered, trying to shake off the image from her mind. She took a deep breath and moved on to the next box. Suddenly, Erwin fell backward, his eyes wide, as if he had seen a ghost. Ellie ran to him, looking back at the box he had just held in his hands. She almost let out a scream, but clapped a hand over her mouth just in time. The box was filled with eerie stuffed animals, not the sweet toy kind, but the real taxidermy kind. Ellie quickly closed the box, unable to stomach the sight. She moved to comfort Erwin, who was still shaking. "It's okay, it's just gross stuff," she whispered, trying to reassure him. Meanwhile, James continued to rummage through Kelvin's stuff, unaffected by the strange discovery. He pulled out more papers, flipping through them carefully, while Ellie kept an eye on the door. Finally, James held up something with wide eyes, and Ellie couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was a newspaper, but not just any newspaper. It was from the day their father had died. James turned it over, reading the headline that confirmed the date. "Why would he have this?" he muttered, his voice barely a whisper as he stared at the paper. Ellie jumped up and snatched the newspaper from James's hands, flipping through it with determination. She scanned the pages, her eyes narrowing at every word. "There has to be something here," she muttered to herself, flipping the pages quickly. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew the newspaper didn't belong with the rest of Kelvin's things. She had no idea what she was looking for. but the newspaper seemed out of place among Kelvin's belongings. It had to mean something. She turned the pages, skimming them, while James and Irwin watched. They were growing anxious as they waited for Ellie to find something useful. Each crinkle of the newspaper seemed louder in the silent room. Then, Ellie suddenly saw something that made her blood run cold. She knew they had to call the police immediately. She didn't hesitate, folding the newspaper and holding it tightly against her chest. She turned to James and Irwin, who both had worried looks on their faces. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, moving to the door. James could see all the color draining from his sister's face. "What is it? What's wrong?" he asked, but Ellie was too afraid to tell him. She kept the newspaper close to her, clutching it like a lifeline. She knew they couldn't stay in that room. "Let's go," she urged, leading them out into the hall where they could speak more freely. "We have to call 911, she said to her brothers, who now both realized how serious the situation had gotten. "But we don't even have cell phones," Irwin whimpered. Ellie shook her head. "There's the landline in the hallway, but we have to be quick." She motioned for them to follow her, making sure the coast was clear before slipping into the hallway. Ellie knew that the landline was in the hallway, but it was very close to the living room, and they could easily be caught if Janet or Kelvin were to go to the toilet. She looked back at her brothers, who were standing close, and took a deep breath. They would have to be fast and quiet to make this work. Luckily, they were all together. Ellie explained her plan before they headed downstairs. "James, you need to be on the lookout while I call 911 on the landline downstairs," she said. She glanced over her shoulder to make sure they weren't being watched before they slowly made their way down the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath their weight. Irwin asked what his part in the plan was, looking up at Ellie with wide eyes. He was too little to be doing this with them, but she didn't want him to feel unimportant. "You'll keep an eye on the back door," she said softly. "If anyone comes that way, let us know." He nodded eagerly, feeling important, ready to do his part. After the tasks were clear for everyone, they silently snuck down the stairs and into the hallway. James kept lookout, peering into the living room, while Irwin took his spot by the back door. Ellie stood by the landline, her fingers hovering over the buttons. The house was quiet, only the murmur of the TV breaking the silence. She pressed the buttons as quietly as she could, but there was no way around the sound. It almost seemed louder in the silent hallway. The steady beep, beep, beep echoed off the walls, and Ellie glanced around nervously. She could hear Kelvin laughing at something on the TV, but her heart raced, knowing he could come into the hallway at any moment. She kept her eyes on James, who was peering into the living room. The door stood slightly ajar, so he could see through a little crack. He watched Kelvin closely, who seemed relaxed and unaware of the kid's plan. Ellie's grip tightened on the phone, praying he wouldn't notice the noise of the landline as she anxiously waited for the dispatcher to respond. Finally, the voice of the dispatcher spoke, and Ellie whispered for the police to come to their house, but the dispatcher didn't hear her. She looked back at James, who was still keeping watch, and tried again, this time a bit louder. Her voice was shaky, but she didn't want to raise it further, not wanting to alert Kelvin to their presence. She whispered again, this time a little louder, and the dispatcher realized he was talking to a child. "Is your mother nearby?" he asked. Ellie glanced towards the living room, afraid of being overheard. She shook her head, knowing he couldn't see, and whispered back, "No, but please hurry." The dispatcher sounded confused, but started asking more questions about their situation. Ellie grew impatient and told the dispatcher to hurry up because her mother was in danger. Just as she spoke, she saw James waving his hands in the air frantically. Someone was coming. She panicked, gripping the phone tightly, trying to wrap up the call quickly. She kept an eye on the living room while clutching the phone receiver, her breath quickening. Ellie quickly whispered her address to the dispatcher and slammed the phone down. She grabbed James and pulled him with her, running up the stairs as quickly and quietly as possible. Their hearts pounded as they darted to Erwin's room. "Hurry," Ellie urged, feeling a knot in her stomach. She prayed the police would arrive before Kelvin realized what they had done. They heard Kelvin yelling from downstairs, "What were you two doing?" But Ellie kept running straight into Erwin's room, where he had been cleaning out everything under his bed. She quickly pulled James inside, and they shut the door behind them, frantically looking around for a hiding spot. They heard Kelvin stomping around below, his angry voice carrying through the house. When they entered Erwin's room, all three of them hid under his bed, holding onto each other for dear life. The space was cramped, with old toys and scattered blankets surrounding them. They held their breath, straining to hear any sound from downstairs. Ellie clutched James's arm tightly, wishing she could shield them from the terror that might come. They heard footsteps coming up the stairs, and it was clear it was Kelvin, as he always stomped his feet. The sound echoed through the hallway, growing louder with each step. The kids trembled beneath the bed, hoping they wouldn't be found. They could hear their heartbeats racing in the silence, praying Kelvin would pass by the room. They heard him open Ellie's room, then James's room, and lastly, he opened Erwin's door. He stood at the doorway, staring into the room. Ellie felt Erwin shaking from fright, clutching tightly to her. She shut her eyes, hoping they'd remain hidden. Kelvin's breathing was heavy, and he stepped into the room, his boots scuffing against the wooden floor. "I know you're in here," Kelvin said, his voice playful but eerie. He got down on his hands and knees and looked under the bed, staring right into Ellie's eyes. "Boo!" he yelled while laughing devilishly. Erwin gasped, and James flinched, but Ellie just glared back. They were trapped, their worst fear realized, as Kelvin's laughter echoed around the room. The three children scrambled away from under the bed, running toward the door, but Kelvin grabbed Ellie by the ankle and pulled her back. "Go get Mom!" she yelled to her brothers, who ran down the stairs. Ellie struggled against Kelvin's grip, kicking and pulling, but he was strong. Her heart pounded as she tried to break free. "Who were you calling?" Kelvin angrily said as he grabbed Ellie's ankle tighter, but Ellie refused to speak to him. He had never hurt her before, but she had never been so scared of him as in that moment. She wriggled and thrashed, trying to loosen his grip. Her mind raced, desperate to escape, but she didn't dare speak a word. "Mom!" she cried, trying to crawl away. Just at that moment, Janet ran up the stairs and burst into the room. "What the heck is going on here? Kelvin, let go of her!" she yelled, pushing Kelvin away. He stumbled backward, letting go of Ellie. She scrambled to her feet, rushing into her mother's arms, tears streaming down her face. Ellie cried as she fell into her mother's arms. "He's not who you think he is, Mom," Ellie cried. Her mother confusedly held her daughter and comforted her, unsure what to think of the situation. Kelvin stood by the door, hands clenched, his eyes narrowed. Janet tried to calm Ellie, stroking her hair gently while the room filled with tension. "Why would you say that, Elle?" Janet asked her daughter. She looked around and saw her two boys standing frightened by the door, unable to keep their eyes off Kelvin, and knew something was going on. She gave them a reassuring smile, though she felt uneasy herself. "Tell me what happened," she asked them all, glancing back at Kelvin with concern. Suddenly they heard police sirens from afar, and Kelvin's eyes widened in shock. He jumped up and ran out of the room, the sound of the sirens growing louder. Janet's eyes followed him as she tightened her grip on Ellie, feeling the tension build. Kelvin's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he fled in a panic, his pace quickening. Janet jumped up as well and followed Kelvin, who ran into Janet's bedroom. "No, no, no, no!" he yelled upon seeing his stuff all over the room from when the children went through it. He kicked at the boxes, scattering papers and clothes across the floor. His eyes darted around, searching for something, his breathing rapid as he panicked. "You went through my things!" he yelled at Ellie as he stormed out of the room and walked up to Ellie threateningly. His eyes were wild with rage, and Ellie stepped back, trembling. Janet rushed to her, trying to shield her daughter from Kelvin's wrath. "Stay back!" she shouted at him, standing firm between them, refusing to let him hurt Ellie. Janet stepped in between them, protecting her daughter from Kelvin, who was raging with anger. "Leave her alone," she ordered, her voice firm. Kelvin stopped, his eyes narrowing as he took a step back. The sound of the police sirens was now much louder. Kelvin's gaze darted to the window as the police car pulled up outside their home. The police banged their fists on the front door, ordering someone to open it. Kelvin told everyone to stay quiet and not move a muscle. He pointed his finger at Janet, motioning for her to stay still. The tension in the room was palpable, the children looking nervously between their mother and Kelvin, unsure of what would happen next. Fearing the police would go away, Ellie went against Kelvin's orders, yelling, "We're in here!" Her voice echoed through the house, and the police burst through the door. She gripped her mother tightly, hoping the officers would come quickly. The children's eyes widened as they heard heavy footsteps racing up the stairs, the clatter of boots echoing down the hall. 2 police officers ran up the stairs, their guns drawn, yelling at Kelvin to put his arms up in the air and face the wall. Kelvin's eyes darted between the officers, then to the family. Janet and the kids huddled together as Kelvin hesitated, but the officers continued to yell at him, forcing him to slowly turn around and comply. Janet had no idea what was going on and demanded an explanation from her daughter, who was crying her eyes out at the sight of the police officers and their guns. She had already seen enough pain and was overwhelmed by what was happening. "Ellie, what's going on?" she asked urgently, trying to understand the chaos that was unfolding around her. "He hit Daddy with his car," Ellie eventually cried out. She ran into her mother's room and grabbed the newspaper from the bed to show her. She pointed to the headline of the article that marked the day her father had died. Janet's eyes widened, disbelief etched on her face, as she stared at the paper, still struggling to understand. Janet looked into the newspaper, and her face turned pale. There was a red circle around the news article about her late husband's accident, and a sentence written next to it in red as well. "I did this." Her hands trembled as she read it, and she looked up at Kelvin. "Take him away," she ordered the officers, tears streaming down her face. It was a written confession, and there was no way around Kelvin's guilt. Janet's eyes filled with tears as she told the officers to take Kelvin away and lock him up. The officers nodded, leading Kelvin out of the room with his hands cuffed. He glared back at Janet and the kids as they dragged him downstairs and out the door. When the officers left with Kelvin, the house quieted down again, and only the quiet sobs from Ellie and her brothers were heard. Janet had never felt so guilty in her life. She stood there, frozen, looking around at her children, overwhelmed by the pain she had unknowingly caused them. The weight of Kelvin's actions pressed heavily on her. She crouched down and consoled her children while crying herself too. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, knowing words could not heal what she had broken. She wrapped her arms around Ellie, James, and Erwin, holding them close. Their tears fell silently onto her shoulder as she rocked them gently, hoping that this would be the beginning of their healing. It would be a long road for them to heal from what they had gone through, but Janet was now more motivated than ever to do right by her children and not let them down again. She promised herself to be there for them and never let anyone else cause them harm. She hugged her children close, vowing to protect them. She was later informed that Kelvin was found guilty of the hit and run, and she threw all of his things in the dumpster. He wouldn't be needing them in jail anyway. She felt a mix of relief and anger as she watched the last of his belongings disappear into the trash, determined to leave this chapter of her life behind. Janet divorced Kelvin while he was in jail and severed all ties with him. She filed the paperwork quickly, her signature a final end to that dark chapter. She didn't hesitate, knowing it was the right thing to do. Kelvin's influence no longer haunted the family, and Janet was ready to move forward, focusing on building a safer future for her children. Slowly, Ellie saw her old, loving mother return to who she was before the death of her father, and it made her heal faster too. Janet became more involved in her children's lives, sharing moments with them like she used to. She laughed more often, and her eyes regained their old sparkle. Ellie felt a sense of comfort seeing her mother happy again. Janet promised her children never to bring strange men into the house again without talking to them first and knowing for certain that those men were harmless. She learned to value their opinions and was determined not to repeat the same mistake. She spoke openly with her children about their concerns, reassuring them that their safety was her top priority. It wasn't only the bond with her children Janet had to mend. She had to rebuild her relationship with her mother as well. She made a conscious effort to reach out to her mom, often inviting her over for family dinners. Janet knew that trust had to be rebuilt slowly, and she was committed to repairing the relationships that Kelvin had fractured. Ellie and her brothers never saw Kelvin again. After 3 years, when all the bonds were healed, Janet introduced a kind, loving man to her children, whom they welcomed with open arms. They could see the change in their mother, and they trusted her judgment. The family felt whole again, and they embraced this new chapter with a renewed sense of hope.